I'm Mark Golub, and in election 2016, suddenly and finally, Israel has been pushed front and center. The issue has exploded primarily because of an interview Bernie Sanders gave to the Daily News and then to the recent debate on CNN between Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton. In both situations, Bernie Sanders was very critical of the state of Israel for its conduct in the war 2014 in Gaza, accusing Israel of using disproportionate force. And that became a major theme for a good period of time in the CNN debate. What does it mean, disproportionate force, and how should people who care about Israel react to the entire issue that's been raised by Bernie Sanders and was addressed somewhat by Hillary Clinton? For some answers, we are thrilled to have back on our phones the Professor Emeritus at Harvard Law School and one of America's leading liberal voices, who is also a leading spokesperson in defense of the State of Israel. And he's also the author of a wonderful new book that deals with the Jewish tradition and law, called Abraham, the first but certainly not the last Jewish lawyer. What a privilege it is to have once again Alan Dershowitz. Alan, thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you so much. You know, what he said about disproportionate force is not only bad for Israel, it's very bad for the United States. Is he suggesting that if there were rockets being directed at New York City or at San Francisco or terror tunnels being built underneath our cities, that he would not do what was necessary to stop our civilians from being targeted? When President Obama, and you might agree or disagree with his policies in Israel, but when he went to State Road, at least he was there. He saw it with his own eyes. And he said, if rockets were being aimed at my daughter's house, I would do everything in my power to stop it, and I would expect that Israel will do everything in its power to stop it. But Sanders, who knows nothing about the Middle East, who doesn't know the difference between 700 people being killed to a human shield and 10,000 people being killed, who's a total ignoramus on this issue, is suddenly telling Israel how to defend its own civilians. And, you know, you can be critical of Israel's policies on settlements or maybe on the occupation. Reasonable people can disagree about that, but you can't call yourself pro-Israel if you are trying to second-guess how Israel defends itself against the kind of terror tunnel they found yesterday, or at least revealed yesterday, against the kind of explosions that may have been a terrorist attack today in Jerusalem. You cannot simply stand there and sit in judgment on a fellow democracy, how they defend their own citizens. And it gives me real pause as to what he would do if he was commander-in-chief and we were ever attacked. Would he demand that for every person killed in America, only one enemy soldier would be killed? He doesn't even understand what the concept of proportionality means in international law. All it means is that the value of the military target has to be proportionate to the number of civilians you anticipate killing, especially when they're human shields, which is how Hamas conducts its war, by hiding behind civilians and committing a double war crime, aiming its rockets at Israeli civilians and using its own civilians as a protection against a legitimate military attack.
By the way, I want you to expand on that. You've spoken to me once before on this issue. There is a sort of simplistic notion that proportionate force, as opposed to disproportionate force, means that one army will not kill a whole lot more of the enemy than were killed itself. You explained to me before and to our audience that's not what international law defines as disproportionate force. Speak to that one more moment.
That's right. I think a lot of people confuse it. It doesn't mean if they kill one of your soldiers, you have to just kill one of their soldiers. If they attack at Pearl Harbor and, you know, kill a lot of Americans, we're entitled to kill an unlimited number of Japanese soldiers or German soldiers. There's no rule of proportionality when it comes to military targets. You're entitled, in fact, you're supposed to engage in disproportionate responses to protect your own citizens. The only meaning of the word proportionality is if you're aiming at a legitimate military target, but the military target is hidden among civilians, then you have to ask yourself the question, is the value of the military target sufficiently high to justify the potential killing of some civilians in the course of the military action you're going to take? And Israel, the answer it gives is yes, of course, because it minimizes the number of civilian casualties more than any other country. It sends telephonic warnings, email warnings, little droplet bombs on the roof. It does everything in its power to reduce civilian casualties, even though Hamas uses what's called the dead baby strategy, that is putting its rockets close to babies and building its tunnels near children so that Israel is put to the choice of either letting its own civilians die or responding and taking military action, which may result in a small number of civilian deaths. So Israel is better than any other country in the world in minimizing civilian casualties, and yet Bernie Sanders has the incredible chutzpah to sit from a comfortable office in Vermont, which hasn't been attacked for a long time, and tell Israel how to protect its own civilians. That's where he lost me. That's where I say he's not pro-Israel. You can't be pro-Israel and be sitting in judgment and second-guessing how Israel defends itself against terror rockets and terror tunnels.
Okay, I want to ask you a simple question. When you saw, and you witnessed it in close up, Alan, when you saw what Israel did during the 2014 Gaza war, did you say to yourself, Israel is using disproportionate force?
No, absolutely not. In fact, in several of the wars, Israel didn't use sufficient force. If I had been said that the goal is to not only destroy the tunnels and the rockets, but to destroy the infrastructure of Hamas, which is an enemy terrorist organization. But reasonable people in Israel said no, they will stop when the terror tunnels are destroyed or stop when the rockets are quiet. But I can't imagine any reasonable person making the argument that Israel engaged in disproportionate military response after waiting years and years to respond to 10,000 rockets. And now Israel is facing 100,000 rockets from Hezbollah, some of them in smart bombs, intelligently guided. And Israel is going to have to make a very hard decision about whether or not to attack those rockets, which are also buried underneath homes and in areas where there are civilians, quite deliberately and quite purposely.
Alan, what do you think would have satisfied Bernie Sanders or anybody who says Israel used disproportionate force? What would proportionate force look like to them, would you imagine?
Well, somebody should ask that question to Bernie Sanders. And he hasn't answered that. There was a great Saturday Night Live special with Larry David playing Sanders, and when Larry David was asked a hard question, he said, well, yada, da, 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 da. He didn't answer. He just did yada, da. And the person interviewing him says, you can't yada, da that. That's the specifics we're asking for. And nobody knows what Bernie Sanders means. Look, he's been listening to people from the hard left who use the word disproportionate as a code word for war crimes, genocidal activities against Israel. He doesn't know anything about Israel. He claims he's been to Israel. Well, yeah. He went to a Shomer HaSa'ir kibbutz many, many years ago when Israel was a very different country, before Hamas came into being, before Hezbollah came into being, before really even the PLO came into being. And he's now lecturing Israel based on a few weeks in a kibbutz, picking, I don't know what he was picking, but it's just not appropriate for him to be doing that, particularly out of incredible ignorance of the kind that he reflected when he said that 10,000 civilians had been killed.
Yes. Look, one of the things that has troubled me, and I know what good friends you are with the Clintons, so I asked this question very gently of you. When I watched the debate on CNN, I was appalled at Bernie Sanders' answer, but I was uncomfortable that Hillary Clinton could not simply say, of course Israel did not use disproportionate force. And I've published a piece that was in Times of Israel, and I've received some real criticism from those who are very much supportive of Hillary Clinton when I said I believe that a presidential candidate cannot say Israel used disproportionate force and must say, in fact, Israel did not. Very similar to the type of things I hear you're saying now on JBS. How do you
Well,
react to Hillary Clinton's inability to say clearly she did not feel, she does not believe Israel used disproportionate force in the 2014 war?
Well, I think she came very close to saying that, and I think she did say that had the Palestinians accepted her husband's proposal back in 2001 at Camp David at Taba, there'd be a two-state solution, and Yasser Arafat made the terrible mistake of turning it down. Look, what I fear is that Bernie Sanders has too much influence right now within the Democratic Party. If he loses the primaries and if he loses his candidacy and isn't the candidate, he will have more power than if he wins. Because if he wins and is the Democratic nominee, at most he'll win 2 states. He'll do what Dukakis and McGovern did, and he'll be laughed out of the Democratic Party. Will have no influence or power. But if he loses and doesn't get the nomination, but he's close, he will succeed in pushing Hillary Clinton further to the left on some issues. I actually thought that Hillary Clinton did quite well in responding on the Israel issue, and I think she did, in effect, say that Hamas does use human shields. She did use that term, does hide behind civilians, and you have to understand that when you're evaluating Israel's actions
Of course.
in defending its own civilians.
Yes. Alan, do you believe Bernie Sanders is either anti-Israel or anti-Semitic?
Oh, he's certainly not anti-Semitic.
Of course not.
And I wouldn't call him anti-Israel,
I
but I
agree.
wouldn't call him pro-Israel. I don't think he's entitled to call himself pro-Israel if he second-guesses Israel's efforts to defend its own citizens. I think he's neutral on Israel. I think he sees Israel as a difficult country. I don't think he has any love in his heart for Israel. And, I don't like candidates when they say, well, I have relatives. Some of my best friends are Jews and some of my best relatives are Israelis.
Yes.
That doesn't cut it. I want to know what your positions are on Israel. I want to know what will happen when Hamas continues to build tunnels and send rockets, and Hezbollah begins to rain rockets down in Israel, and Israel has to respond and defend its citizens. I want to know where you're going to stand on that. Are you going to help Israel? Are you going to send them additional armaments? Or are you going to say, no, they acted disproportionately and they can't count on our assistance? That's what I want to hear. And I think that Bernie Sanders fails those tests. So
Okay.
I wouldn't call him anti-Israel, but I certainly wouldn't call him pro-Israel.
I love the distinction. There was a piece in today's New York Times by Roger Cohen, who is among those who are now celebrating Bernie Sanders for ostensibly bringing an issue that was underground in the Jewish community out into the light. This divide in the Jewish world between those who Roger Cohen would suggest are Israel right or wrong, and those who stand over against Israel, who support Israel, but who have a more J Street orientation, an orientation that we heard articulated by Bernie Sanders, that Israel does things that are wrong, uses disproportionate force, and American Jewry must be critical of it. What's your sense of that whole discussion?
I think it's total nonsense. I think that there are 2 kinds of Jews. There are those who support Israel, sometimes critically, sometimes uncritically. I don't think there are people who are Israel firsters. We're American firsters. But there are those who support Israel, as I do, somewhat critically. I'm opposed to its settlement policy and opposed to some of its other policies. But I will not second-guess Israel's military actions in defending its civilians. And then there's J Street. J Street is not pro-Israel. I challenge anybody to find any press release that J Street has made in the last 10 years since it was established that celebrates Israel, that supports Israel, that says good things about Israel. All it does is criticize Israel, and it gives legitimacy to the Israel haters. To me, the issue of whether you're pro-Israel and anti-Israel is as much in your heart as it is in your words. Mm-hmm. People from J Street thrive when they can criticize Israel and apply a double standard to it. Many within J Street support the BDS movement, although the organization itself does not. But the BDS movement is directed only against Israel. They don't support sanctions against Cuba, against Iran, against China, against Russia, against Belarus, against other countries that oppress human rights. It's only against Israel. And J Street also singles out Israel for unjust criticism. No country is perfect. but the idea of demanding perfection only from a country surrounded by enemies sworn to its destruction is a form of international anti-Semitism. That is, treating Israel as the Jew among nations and holding it to a separate standard. It reminds me of President Lowell when he was the president of Harvard, and he was an anti-Semite and refused to allow Jews into Harvard. And he said, because Jews cheat. And Judge Leonard Hand wrote back and said, but Gentiles cheat too. And he said, you're changing the subject now. We're talking only about Jews.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what happens with J Street. You tell them that there are other countries that violate the pristine norms of perfection and human rights, and they say, you're changing the subject. We're talking about Israel. That's what the United Nations does. That's what Bernie Sanders does. I haven't heard him criticize other countries. I haven't heard him criticize NATO's actions in Afghanistan and in Syria and in other places where civilians are killed. Only Israel deserves his criticism and gets his criticism. There's something in his heart that makes it easier for him to criticize Israel than to criticize other countries, particularly leftist countries.
And what do you answer when there are those who say, and they say it in all honesty from their perspective, Israel should want to be held to and is being held to a higher standard, not, by the way, a higher standard to, Arab countries or third world countries or communist countries, but we do hold Israel to a higher standard even when we compare it to Western countries.
Well, that's just dead wrong. Israelis have a right to hold their own country to a higher standard, just like Americans have the right to hold America to a higher standard. But how dare any Frenchman or any British person or anybody else, any American, hold Israel to a higher standard than they hold their own country or other countries that they support. That's just discrimination and bigotry. And it also means you're holding other countries to a lower standard, and you're justifying violations of human rights by other countries if you hold them to a lower standard. That just doesn't work.
What about Jews? I hear this, that the Jewish people, that's J Street's argument, by the way. We are Jews, and we want to hold Israel to a Jewish standard, which is a higher standard than even we would hold the United States.
There's a very simple solution to that. Make Aliyah, go to Israel, and then you're entitled to hold your country to a higher standard.
Okay.
But until you send your children on the buses in the morning, until you send your child to join the army, until you send your child to the pizza parlor, not knowing whether he or she is going to come back alive, don't sit in judgment on what Israel has to do to defend its own civilians against terrorist attacks. Doesn't matter what your ethnicity is. Doesn't matter what your religion is. You want to be an Israeli, then you can hold your country to a higher standard. If you're not an Israeli, you cannot hold your country to a different standard, to a higher standard.
Okay.
Because that's racism. That means you're holding other countries or other religions or other religious groups to a lower standard.
Exactly.
And being a Jew doesn't give you permission to endanger Israel's security.
Mm-hmm. You have written a great deal, not only about Israel, but about Jewish life. When you and I first met in the 1990s, it was after your wonderful book, Chutzpah, came out. And you've written about American Jewish life in a number of books, and you speak about it all the time. In terms of American Jewry, American Jews both want to and are encouraged to feel that they have a stake in the state of Israel, that we are one. And if there are any Jews hearing you now who are saying to themselves, I don't understand how Alan can say on the one hand, I, an American Jew, should feel part of the state of Israel. Doesn't that give me a right to participate in the discussion and to express my positions on every issue, including military situations? And what would Alan say to me?
Absolutely not. You have no right, just because you support a country, to tell it how to conduct its military operations. First of all, if you do, you generally have no idea what you're talking about, just like Bernie Sanders. He doesn't know what he's talking about. I know much more than he does. I've been at many military briefings. I've spoken to the chiefs of staff. I've lectured to the military college there, and I wouldn't presume to tell them how to conduct military operations. I know they're decent people who try to minimize civilian casualties, but their first obligation is not to make Jews of America happy. Their first obligation is to protect and defend the citizens of Israel, Arab citizens of Israel, Christian citizens of Israel, white, black, citizens of Israel. That's their obligation. You can support Israel. Go ahead. You can buy bonds, but that doesn't give you any right to participate in decisions involving Israel's national security or the defense of its civilians. There's only one basis for having that right, that is making Aliyah and becoming a full citizen of Israel. But when it comes to military decisions about how, within fairness, respond to these terrorist attacks that most American Jews have no idea about, then I think a little deference, a little humility in the face of your own ignorance is probably a pretty good starting point.
Okay. By the way, Alan, as somebody who has been long associated with the Democratic Party, are you concerned at all with the kind of eruption of applause that comes, we believe, from the far left of the Democratic Party? But as you said a little earlier, what Bernie Sanders has done is pushed Hillary Clinton to the left. The entire party seems to be moving to the left. When it comes specifically to the issue of the Democratic Party's embrace or non-embrace of Israel, how do you view it?
Well, I completely agree. I think that there is a movement within the left of the Democratic Party against Israel, and it not only reflects itself in the kind of boos and applause that Bernie Sanders got, but at the last convention when there was mention of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel and other kinds of things. There are people out there, and they're primarily Bernie Sanders supporters who hate Israel, who would like to see Israel destroyed. Those are among his supporters. The people of the hard left, many from Move On, from Black Lives Matter, from Code Pink, are virulently anti-Israel. We're not talking about attitudes of the kind that Bernie Sanders himself has. I'm talking about real hatred toward the nation state of the Jewish people. And you see that. By the way, you see a little of that in the supporters of Hillary Clinton, too. Max Blumenthal, particularly the young one, Max Blumenthal, who's written Nazi-type attacks on Israel.
Yes.
And presumably, I assume he's a supporter of Hillary Clinton. Certainly his father, Sidney, is a supporter of Hillary Clinton. And, there's Pat Buchanan on the Republican side. So if you're a Republican, make sure that the Republican Party remains pro-Israel. And if you're a Democrat, do everything in your power, and it's harder to do, to make sure that this remains a bipartisan issue and that Democratic Party continues to support Israel.
Okay, we're almost out of time, so I have some very quick questions to ask you. I saw you on Fox with Megyn Kelly talking about your personal experience with Ted Cruz. He was a student of yours. You said he was very bright, yes?
He was, yeah. He is, yeah.
Okay. Did this mean you were endorsing him in any way?
Oh, no. I made it clear. I'm a liberal Democrat. I support Hillary Clinton. But Ted Cruz is a smart guy. And I'm not going to lie about that. I'm a teacher. And his teacher has an obligation to tell the truth. He was a very, very good student. He was a pleasure to have in class. He spoke up all the time. And he was off the charts brilliant. I love students like that, whether they're right, left, or center.
Good for you. Now, speaking about the law, we have seen that recently there was this nonsense of a case that involved you in Great Britain, and the case was virtually thrown out of court. I say mazel tov to you, but it must be an enormous burden lifted off of you.
Well, I always knew it was a phony, made-up charge. So, yes, it lifts the burden off me. But the idea that this woman could get away with making a false charge against me, one that we were able to disprove mathematically, prove that I could not have been in the various exotic places she claimed she was with me on a Caribbean island, in a ranch in New Mexico, on a private jet flying above the air, and in homes in Palm Beach, Florida. I was never in those places during the relevant period of time, and I gave all of my records to the former head of the FBI, Louis Freeh. He made a complete, with his staff, evaluation of the records and concluded that all of the charges were refuted and couldn't be true. And so, I'm happy that the world now as a whole knows that there was no truth to this. The lawyers also withdrew all the charges, including her affidavit sworn under oath, and acknowledged that they had made a mistake in filing them.
Anyway,
I'm glad it's over.
I am thrilled for you. But, you have been inside the law your entire professional life, your entire life, right, Alan. And at the moment, there is less and less faith in the legal system, even a system which would really defame you and turn you into, you are an international playboy, according to this lawsuit.
Right. Oh, yeah.
What would you say to
that's
people?
Just me. I've been married 30 years to the same woman. and I have the most boring, personal life other than loving my wife. But the idea that they would go after me shows you, how desperate this woman was. And she did it purely for money, and hopefully she's not going to get any. And I'd like to see law enforcement look into this and see whether she should be indicted for perjury, for repeatedly swearing under oath to
She should
not only
be.
falsehood, but provable falsehood.
She should be. All right, my very last question. So we talked about this recently. The TV series about the O.J. case has now come to a close. I asked you a question, and I felt afterward I didn't ask it properly. I want to ask it one more time. The series portrayed a moment when you're working with those students who are helping you prepare for the case. And in this episode, it says that you suddenly, while you're watching TV, get the idea of raising an alternative defense or creating doubt in the jury's mind by suggesting the Colombian necktie. Did that happen?
No, it didn't. And I would never have done that because that was not my strategy. My strategy was to demonstrate that the prosecution and the police had tampered with evidence. And the focus I wanted was to be on the prosecution and the police's actions and not on alternative theories of how this might have happened. So that was a completely made-up scene. But in general, the portrayals of the characters, some were accurate, some were not. Marcia Clark was, I think, pretty accurate. Bob Shapiro was not. I was on it for too short a period of time to make any assessment. But that particular episode was just made up out of whole cloth.
All right,
also.
good to hear.
It was not my idea. It was somebody else's.
Okay. In the closing credits, the final credits of the entire series, the actor with the real person was put up on the screen, and there was a little bit of a bio. And what it said when they put up your picture with the actor's picture was that Alan Dershowitz said that this case really wasn't going to be one of the most important cases of all time, and that as far as you were concerned, it was a relatively unimportant legal issue, even though it gained so much attention at the time.
Yeah.
Is that true?
That's true. They didn't ask me about that, but that's true. I think that, the Sharansky case is far more important in my life, helping Natan Sharansky get out of a Soviet prison, saving people from death row, many of the Jewish cases that I've had over the years, fighting for Israel, far more important in my legacy, in my career, in my life, than this one, murder case. I've done 38 murder cases or something like that, and won the vast majority of them. So this is not a unique case in my life history, but it was interesting. It was interesting primarily because of the public reaction, not so much the legal issues.
Exactly. Alan, you know how wonderful it is for me to get a chance to talk to you. I continue
Likewise.
to thank you so much for making yourself available. You have a good Passover holiday, and we'll speak after Pesach.
Same with you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Be well.
Be
Chag
well.
Sameach. Bye.
Professor Alan Dershowitz, former professor of Harvard Law at Harvard Law School, again, one of the leading voices on the liberal American scene, as well as one of the most articulate defenders of the state of Israel. In his latest book on the connection between the Jewish tradition and Western legal tradition is entitled Abraham, the First but Certainly Not the Last Jewish Lawyer. We will have more to say about this. Again, some of you may have seen my piece in the Times of Israel or on the JBS website. It has received a great deal of reaction, and I'll be sharing that with you on an upcoming edition of Election 2016. And for me, I was very disappointed in both Bernie Sanders, and I was disappointed that Hillary Clinton, for all the positive things she had to say about Israel, could not say Israel was not guilty of disproportionate force in the war in Gaza. My thanks, as always, to our director, Sloan Copeland, production coordinator, Serge Goldberg, JBS's associate director, Dara Golub, and to the producer of this edition of In the News, Carol Lilienthal. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. Be well, my friends.